This is an interesting book of the Bible. Have any of you guys read ahead a little bit? Anybody maybe done that? It's an interesting book, isn't it? It's a challenging book. Some of it's challenging just because of the genre that it's written in. It doesn't read like one of the New Testament letters. The New Testament letters, like if you read Romans, 1 Corinthians, any of those kind of things, they read like things we're just more used to because they kind of make their point in the beginning and then they just sort of defend the point and then come to a conclusion. But there's certain genres in the Bible that don't do that. They're written in a different way. And Ecclesiastes is a little bit of that. It's unique because it's kind of got a couple different genres going on. And it's got an argument that it's going to make throughout that it's sort of, in some sense, spiraling around at times. So it's just an interesting book. But the main point of the book that Pastor Chris touched on last week, that we're going to continue touching on, is that everything under the sun is ultimately meaningless. That's what he says over and over again. There's a word that he uses in Hebrew. It's called hevel. Means vanity, means vapor, meaningless, kind of depends. You can translate it different ways. But that's like the main point of his book. That's kind of crazy, isn't it? Like everything under the sun is hevel. It is vapor. It's the mist. And so what we've been talking about is how life's pointlessness points to Christ. And what we're going to see as we continue through this book is that through this book, God is deconstructing our lives under the sun and pointing our eyes above the sun where Christ is. When our hearts are fixed above the sun on Christ himself, then we can actually come back beneath the sun and begin to find joy even in the midst of the frustrations of this world. Because this world has many frustrations, right? You guys know that? I know that. I've tasted of that. This book first is going to tear everything apart under the sun, expose it as it truly is, so that it might build us back up, and so that it might pull us above the sun to not place our hope down here. And so really for the first 6 chapters of this book, and depending on how it parses out, we're going to have probably somewhere 7 to 10 sermons altogether where this book is just going to be sort of tearing at the fabric of our existence in a lot of ways and just peeling back layers and exposing it for what it really is. But it's not doing that to be cruel. God has not given this book to be cruel. He's actually given it for our joy so we might see life as it really is and find joy where it is really to be found, even in the midst of those frustrations. So I want to invite you guys, if you haven't already, turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. It's going to be in the Old Testament. If you have a Bible app, go ahead and turn there. If you have neither, there's probably a black hardcover Bible somewhere around you that you can feel free to grab and to use. We're going to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 12 through 18. So when you guys are ready, if you're willing and able, I'm going to invite you to stand for the reading of God's word. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 12 to 18. It says this: I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a striving after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. This is the word of the Lord for us today. You guys can be seated. So the main point for us today is this: wisdom and knowledge can't fix life under the sun. That's essentially what Solomon is saying. Wisdom and knowledge cannot fix life under the sun. There's going to be 4 points that we're going to look at today. Point number 1, it's going to be to learn from King Solomon. Point number 2 is don't try to out-knowledge the curse. Point number 3 is don't hurry people past the curse. Point number 4 is going to be to look to Christ, our wisdom. So let's jump right in. Point number 1, let's learn from King Solomon. So in this first point, what we're going to really do is actually walk through the entire text in the first point of the sermon. And part of the reason for that is because the text itself is not incredibly complex. There's really one clear point that Solomon, as the preacher, he has for us. And so we're going to walk through the text, and then over the other 3 points of the sermon, we'll look at some practical implications from the text. But first, we're going to learn from King Solomon. So he starts out in verse 12. He says, so I trained, wrong verse 12, I'm sorry. He says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. So he starts off telling us who he is, and in a sense, he's making a case. He's building a case for himself. He's saying, I was the king of Israel. This is a way of showing his credentials. He'll do this several times throughout the book as a way of basically saying, I know what I'm talking about. Pastor Chris laid some of that out last week, talked about his position, talked about his life experience at this point. He's kind of a grandpa of sorts who is writing as a man of faith, but a man who has had much experience and even some privileged experience so that he knows what he's talking about. In fact, this statement from Solomon that we have here in chapter 1, verse 12 is really serving as an introduction to several points he's going to make going all the way through chapter 2. Because for the next several passages in the book, he's going to tell us, I was king over Israel, and I used that position to discover that wisdom and knowledge, which is today, that self-indulgence, that wise practical living, and that our work are all full of vanity. And so that's what he's saying. He's saying, this is my badge, this is my credentials. I've had experience, I've had position. I know what I'm talking about. And so he starts here by telling us in the first part of verse 13, he says, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. And so he used a privileged position that he had as the king, and he leveraged it toward this end. He says, I'm the king, and I use it to learn, to seek out wisdom, to seek out knowledge. His privileged position as that king would have afforded him great opportunities. He would have had instant access to the strongest PhD programs that all of Israel had to offer. And they would have been tuition free. They would have paid him to come. There would have been nobody that would have had type of access to all of the information, all of the learning, all of the possible wisdom, knowledge, education that nation at the time would have had to offer. He would have had all of it at his fingertips. And indeed, he's saying, I took all of the programs. I wrote the thesis. I have as much knowledge as someone who has 10 PhDs, and I'm here to tell you that I've learned some things. The challenge that, again, so much of these early chapters of the book in general are going to teach us is that in his seeking, he has some answers, and they're answers that are pretty hard to hear at first, but they're helpful if we take them in and consider them. And he has the answer for us in the second half of verse 13. Starting in verse 13, he says, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. And then here's what he's found. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He says, I am the king. I have access to all types of knowledge. I have used that knowledge to learn some things. And here's what I've learned. That God has given us a hard life. All the PhDs have shown me most clearly that God has given us a hard life. Do you feel that? Do you resonate with that? Like the frustrations of life? Like I don't think, so one of the things going through Ecclesiastes that we need to be really do is pull ourselves into. Not be really quick to go to the solution, especially because for Christians, we've got a little bit of theological understanding, like we can do this thing where our brains just will run very quickly to true things, but they won't have the effect that this book intends to have for our good. So the first thing that he's calling us to do here is to sit in that. God has given us a hard life. It is unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Solomon looks at his life. He looks at the life of people around him. He sees through the veneer and recognizes it all for what it is, and he simply says, this is a hard life. And it is a hard life. That's what makes this book so helpful, because of how true it actually is. Because this life is hard. It's exhausting. The normal parts of going to work and coming home, taking care of the house, taking care of family, paying bills, it's all hard. It's all exhausting. It's all tiring. And that's just the normal stuff. Like that's when life is going well. That's not even accounting for the numerous ways that disaster strikes. just hard, isn't it? Like, he's right. It's hard. Life under the sun is hard because our minds are weak, our bodies are fragile, and our hearts have a consistent ache for something else, for something different, for something more. We can often think, is this all there is to life? Just running around like a crazy person all the time. So frustrating. Solomon says, I'm the smartest person in this entire nation, and I've learned a lot of things, and I'm here to tell you that life is hard. It's one of the truly beautiful things about this book is if we'll sit in it, it does not hide from those realities. In fact, this book, written by Solomon, inspired by God himself, is brutally honest about the circumstances of life that we all feel, but we've often been sort of trained to be less than honest about. Barnes & Noble has whole sections devoted to positive thinking that serve to merely cover up the hard and painful realities of the world. Like, we should sort of just positive thinking ourselves out of them. That's not the same thing as falling into ditches, but there's a reality that life is just hard, and there's kind of a whole industry that is sort of out there to kind of be like, stop paying attention to it. Just pay attention to this. Just think these flowery thoughts. The problem is that none of us can live there because life just isn't there. And so you just go back and forth. At best, you yo-yo out of it. But there's a whole section, a whole industry that's just devoted to saying, don't think about how hard life really is. And so that's where Solomon comes in and he just busts that up. He's past that. And unfortunately, there can oftentimes be some Christian spaces that develop their own type of pop psychology versions of the faith that don't know how to deal honestly with hard reality either. It's like the positive thinking thing. It's got a Jesus spin on it. But it just keeps us, and we can sometimes be trained to just not acknowledge that life is really what it is. It's hard. That's what Solomon says. Dr. Solomon, as a man of faith, affirms what we all know to be true in our guts, that it is just hard. What makes it even a bit more pointed from Solomon's words is that he tells us it's hard because God has made it that way. He says, it is an unhappy business that God has given the children of man to be busy with. So why has God made it hard? We should ask that. We should look at that. We should wonder that. Why does Solomon think it's not just sort of hard on its own in a random cosmic way, but he says it's an unhappy business that God has given to us? So why is that? The answer to that question is really one of the main keys to understanding where this book is. So I want to encourage you here to listen. Life is hard because we live in a post-Edenic exile. That's a big word. To make it more simple, life is hard because we are living outside of the garden of God that we were created to live in. That's why it's hard. We live our entire existence in a very real type of spiritual exile. We are not home, and we recognize that, and our world reflects that constantly. We are outside of the garden, living in exile because of sin. And in fact, our life is hard here because God has indeed cursed the world we inhabit because of sin. And that's where God begins to come back into it. If we were to read Genesis chapter 3, you can turn there if you like. I'm not going to read the text. But it says that after our first parents, Adam and Eve, disobeyed God, God says this. This is a direct quotation from Genesis chapter 3. God says this to Adam. He says, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree, cursed is the ground because of you. And in pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. That last verse sounds a lot like my life experience. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. In pain you will try to take care of a house that wants to constantly fall apart. In pain you will try to take care of a family, and it's going to be frustrating, and you're going to have miscommunication, and it's going to be hard. In pain, you will go and work a job and try to do your best to only feel like the whole thing is fighting against you at the same time. In pain, you will try to be faithful to God and find frustration after frustration after frustration in every single area of your life. If it's not touching one area, it will touch another one soon. He says, in pain, you shall eat of your life here, in pain all the days of your life. And there's a key word there. He tells Adam, he says, because of you. He tells Adam, because of your sin. God says to Adam, I created you to live above the sun. I would have been your God, your sustainer, your helper, your provider, and your father all the days of your life, but instead, you chose to live under the sun, to put your hope in the fruit beneath the sun, and therefore I will curse everything beneath the sun because of you. And this was true of Adam, and it's true for us as well. Our lives beneath the sun are cursed. They're cursed by God over the whole creation because of the sin of our first parents, but we taste of that because we sin along with them. So our lives beneath the sun are cursed because we set our affections on the things that are beneath the sun instead of the one who is above it. And we sin ultimately because we serve the one that we love, which is ourselves and not God. And here's an important point. I want you to hear this. It is God's kindness that he has cursed everything under the sun. It is his kindness that he has cursed everything under the sun. Why would I say that? Because, like our first parents, we are so prone to put our hope in the stuff under the sun. If our lives were smooth, our lives were easy, our lives had no frustration to them at all, we would never look above the sun. We would never care about God at all. We're so prone to self-sufficiency in the midst of the mess. Like in the midst, I know my whole life is frustrating, but I am still convinced that I can hold it together. And it's God's kindness that he curses the life under the sun, rather than let us sit there just groveling in the mud, building little empires out of mud and saying, look at the great things that I do. And he says, no, in kindness and in love, I am going to frustrate your endeavors so that you will learn to look above the sun. What that means, and Pastor Chris said this a lot last week, it's such a great phrase, I'm probably going to say it again and again, is to follow your frustrations to Christ. The frustrations that you feel from the curse, from the reality, are there by God so that we would not put our hope under the sun, that we would recognize that this place is cursed, that we would look to Christ for all of our hope, all of our joy, and then in that we can then learn to come back and be able to find some joy in the midst of the curse and in the midst of the mess. But there is gospel hidden in that curse that we suffer beneath. And there is a Christ if we follow our frustrations to the end. Dr. Solomon, he tells us that everything is cursed. And he's going to tell us that over and over again throughout the book. And that's what he does in this passage. Verse 14, he says that the curse makes everything under the sun a mere mist. He says in verse 15 that the curse makes the busted things unfixable. And in fact, he dives in particularly to his point here in verses 16 through 18, and he says the curse is actually revealed more through wisdom and knowledge. That's why it can't fix it. He tells us that the problem is that when we increase in knowledge, even if it's good knowledge or bad knowledge, it simply results in greater sorrow. Because more knowledge is wearisome in a fallen world, because more knowledge of the world just means more knowledge of the curse. To study something good like philosophy is to be confronted with the emptiness of the world. To study current events is to be confronted with the injustice of the world. To study history is to be confronted with the fact that everybody everywhere always dies in the end. Greater knowledge leads to greater sorrow. And wisdom and knowledge can't fix life under the sun. That's what Solomon has for us as he continues to expose just the reality of our life under the sun. So what's next? What do we do with that? Because that's basically his point. And he kind of just stops. He's peeling these layers back, and this is the layer he's at. He says you can't out-educate yourself out of this. You can't outthink yourself out of this. So second point is this: don't try to outthink the curse. So let's talk about that. Knowledge can't reverse the curse. So I already mentioned wisdom, knowledge, education, all those things are good and worth pursuing. I have some degrees. Lord willing, I would like to continue. I love to learn. I love to study. Maybe some of you do as well. And when we get our eyes above the sun where Christ is, we get our hope fixed on Christ, then we can turn back and find joy in the midst of the frustrations. In the second half of the book, Solomon's going to talk about that a lot. But for now, he really has us sitting just in this reality that under the sun, even the good pursuit of knowledge will prove ultimately futile to fix our biggest problem. Because it cannot change our hearts that are bent on self-destruction, and it cannot change the frustrating realities of the world that we live in, and it cannot change the great thing that is hovering over really all of Solomon's complaints. It cannot change the fact that the grave is waiting for each one of us at the end. That's the ultimate reason that he just sees through everything. Knowledge can't reverse the curse. At best, it can teach us how to manage it better. And that's Solomon's point, that we should see it for what it is. Knowledge is good. It can discover something like medicine that helps many people. It helps them to delay death longer. But it does not reverse the curse. Knowledge discovers something like philosophy that helps people to understand the world better until the reality of that world overwhelms them and actually take their own lives. That actually has happened a lot to many of the philosophers of the 20th century. Like, many of them are the poster boy for what Solomon is saying. It's like, I learned so much about this world, and I was completely overwhelmed by the reality. Knowledge and education in our younger years. We go to school and they build us up. And they can be good things. They build us up so that we can have a nice life before we end up in the grave. And again, that's just Solomon's point again and again and again. That there's no real hope under the sun with this knowledge, with this education, with this wisdom, because it can't fix the curse. And so it's all hevel. It's all a mist. It's all a vapor. Furthermore, the newest ism of the day can't fix this. What does that mean, the newest ism of the day? It just means none of the prevailing ideologies of the day, which are, again, they're based in knowledge, they're based in wisdom, none of them are going to fix it. Feminism won't bring the type of equality that it seeks. Populism won't bring the prosperity that it seeks. Marxism won't bring the equity that it seeks. And globalism won't bring the universal shalom that it seeks. Because it can't overcome the curse. And the curse is what causes all of the things that we find that we are frustrated about. We live in a day when people will rightly recognize the effects of the curse, but unfortunately, a lot of times, and this is what we do across all generations, is create ideas that we think are the antidote, but are band-aids at best, or will actually serve to deepen the effects of the curse at worst. To make that as clear and as practical as possible, I would say this. If you think of two of the most popular sort of news sites, I have Fox News and CNN. And they're at war with each other, that's true, without question. But even while they are warring with each other, they are equally committed to parading a lineup of snake oil salesmen to sell you on certain ideas that will fix the frustrations of your life. And every time they come up with an ism that says this will fix your problems, they're snake oil salesmen. Even if they don't realize that, but they're selling a fake product. The isms won't fix it. The isms might help you manage some things. They might help us plan things a little better. They might have some general equity effect, but they won't reverse the curse. There's no idea that the world comes up with that's going to help this problem ultimately. It's not going to reverse it. It's chasing after the wind. It's hevel. It's a mist. It's a vapor. Because only Christ can reverse the curse. Knowledge under the sun is a mist, and to put our hope in any of those things, any of the knowledge of the earth, is to set ourselves up for despair. Because knowledge and wisdom can't reverse the curse. The next point I want to make in a practical way is this, is don't hurry people past the curse. So I have a long quote, but I want to read it because it's really good. It's from a guy named Zach Eswine. He says this. He says, Solomon will tell us about God, but not in the manner that we might expect. Solomon is no quick healer. In his evangelism, he has taken the posture not of the sermonizer, but of the pained and skeptical human being, the raw searcher who wants an honest word with no spin about the way things really are. This evangelistic process is a slow one, therefore. Weekend sermons beneath a rented tent will not do. Having integrity regarding what one sees in the world requires honest questions. True questioners will not trifle with quick slogans and slanted banners. Answering wisely takes time. Taking time amid things not yet answers provokes discomfort, and a discomfort that is often required in order to recover spiritual health. So this is a really big practical point that I think we can learn from as we're trying to plant this church. Even once the church is established, we want to be faithful with the gospel in Fairmont and our families and our neighborhoods. In any of those, we should have the method of Ecclesiastes in mind. Not just the content, but the method, because Solomon is slowly and he is patiently peeling back the layers and inviting us to come to terms with the fact. He's making an argument and then inviting us to recognize, yeah, this is true. This is a vapor. That is empty. And Solomon, as he writes this book, he is in no hurry for quick conversions. He is in no hurry to fill a sanctuary or to increase baptism numbers for the year. He's just not in a hurry about any of those things. What he wants is for us to really fully embrace this reality so that we might turn and look above the sun. And so my point with us to think through that is this. Number one is that we don't want to just plant like a big church. We want it to be healthy. We want it to be a place where people are really embracing Christ. And that takes time. It takes time for people to realize that their life really is the hevel, that the things that they put their hope in really are a mist. Because they've spent days, months, weeks, years of their lives building towards something that is a mist. It's going to be a hard thing to overnight all of a sudden realize it's all been a mist. Our goal should be the same as Solomon's, and that's joy that comes from a raw and honest faith that has rightly considered life under the sun and has learned to place its hope with Christ above the sun. And that's just a slow process sometimes, and we want to be okay with that. And this is a word for me personally, maybe as much as anybody here. It's like we want it to be a healthy church, and so we want to engage with people and just allow the process, allow God to do his work in their heart and their life, and just stay with them, continue to share Christ, but nobody's keeping score. That's sort of how fast it happens. We want to be patient and present in the lives of people around us. We want to open our homes, get to know them, get to know their lives, get to know where they are putting their hope in things beneath the sun. Love them, speak with them, and be prepared for when the curse breaks into their life, because it will. Something that they've put their hope in, if you spend enough time with them, will prove to be the mist eventually. So wait for that and be prepared when it happens to patiently show them how to follow their frustrations to Christ. And then do it again and again and again and help them do what Solomon is helping us do, which is just to peel back the layers of our life so that we might look above the sun for our hope. So that means invite them to hang out, invite people into your life, invite them to Sunday gatherings, invite them to play Dungeons and Dragons, invite them to community group. Just invite them in to the life of the church without even feeling the pressure at first to demand anything from them. Just wisely and intentionally invite them in to the process, to recognize their lives, to sit beneath the preaching of the word, to engage with the people of God, and to share Christ with them patiently over time. I think we should have the method of what Solomon does in this book be in our minds as we walk through it together. Finally, I want to invite us to look to Christ, our wisdom. Because the great hope is this, is that Christ himself, he came under the sun so that we could fix our hope above the sun. Another long quote from Zach Eswine, but it is a good one. And our brother says this: "The time will come in which God will personally squint and sweat beneath the sun's light and heat. He will enter the gainless world. He will endure its vanity. He will feel its pain. There will be a day for Solomon, a day coming, when Jesus says, 'In the world you will have tribulation,' when he says, 'The poor you will always have with you.' But when Jesus says that, he'll sound like Solomon. But he'll be able to go further than Solomon ever could. Because Jesus will stand beneath the sun with us. And from there, he will look us in the eye and declare what Solomon cannot. But take heart, because I have overcome the world." Jesus tasted the curse. He was a man of sorrows who was acquainted with grief. The scripture says he was a person that people would hide their faces from. He's tasted the hard life and all of its frustrations. And he stands ready to comfort you in this hard life when you look to him in faith. He has tasted the curse. He has bore the curse. He didn't merely taste it, but he carried the full weight of it like none of us have. The curse was the result of human sin, yours and mine, and Jesus took that curse on himself. That passage we referenced in Genesis chapter 3 there in the beginning talks about how when the earth was cursed, that it would produce thorns when man tried to cultivate something out of it. Well, when King Jesus was hanging on the cross, he was wearing a crown of thorns on his head, bearing the full weight of this frustrating life, the frustration of the curse, bearing it completely on his head for sinners like you and me. And we can be forgiven of our curse-causing sin by looking to him in faith. Not only that, but he rose above the curse. Pastor Chris said in his sermon last week, the truth is, if Jesus had not been raised, then everything we do would be in vain. If he had not been raised from the dead, then nothing under the sun would have changed. But because he has rose from the dead, then everything is different. Because we can look above the sun to the risen Jesus, who is the firstborn of a new creation. And the great evil lurking beneath everything under the sun is death, and Jesus himself has had victory over death. And so if we look to him in faith, we can be assured that we will live even when we die, and we can begin to see life above the sun and let it influence our life beneath it. And the great hope is that he is indeed returning to reverse the curse. He is going to bring a new heavens and a new earth that is free from the curse, free from all of the frustrations, from every single one of them. Can you imagine an existence where your life is actually filled with harmony and peace? It's pretty much unimaginable, right? That's because we don't live there, but Jesus is going to bring it. He is going to bring a new heavens and a new earth where God himself will be the sun that lights the city, and all the earth will be swallowed up in the glory that exists above the sun. When we look to Jesus in faith, this becomes the hope that sustains us within the midst. Wisdom from below the sun cannot reverse the curse, but the wisdom that has come from above can and does and will. Because Christ himself is our wisdom. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 says this: "Where's the one who is wise? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For the Jews demanded signs and the Greeks sought wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews, folly to the Gentiles, but to those who are called, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." The gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news, is the wisdom of God for salvation. It is what takes people like us trapped beneath the effects of our own sin in the cursed world and helps us to lift our eyes and our hearts above the sun. There was a tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden that seemed wise to our first parents, but it plunged us into sin and folly under the sun. There was a tree of knowledge that followed the Garden of Gethsemane, where Christ was crucified. And that tree seems foolish to people, but it is the wisdom and the power of God for salvation to those that place their hope above the sun. Jesus himself is our wisdom. And when our hope is fixed on him above the sun, he gives us wisdom to find joy in the mist below. Because his wisdom shows us that he works the frustrations for our good. His wisdom shows us that he works the curse in the world to lift man's eyes above the sun. His wisdom shows that he works the curse even among us, that we might learn to confess, to repent, to deepen our love for one another. Wisdom and knowledge can't fix life under the sun. But true wisdom has come, and he is bringing the sun down to us. Let me pray for us.